And ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Morning Show. And with me today, I've got a special guest, Gareth Cliff. Hello, Gareth. Welcome to the show. First time you're doing a show with me.
I know. I'm really happy to be, especially in the same week as you put out that hilarious video with people asking, "Where's where's Rahman?"
Where's Ramon?
I love it, man. Yeah, it's nice to be on the show. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So, for those of you who don't know who Gareth is, who are you, Gareth, and what's your history?
I'm the worst at giving my own biography. I've been in media, television, radio, podcasting for 25 years. Probably about, I don't know, 20,000 hours under the belt. Most of it not particularly praiseworthy. A lot of it just entertainment content, but primarily in the last 10 years, we've done a lot to pioneer podcasting. I did a lot of that with Rena Bromberg when we started Cliff Central, and kind of set it up as one of the first proper commercial ventures in that arena, something which I'm delighted to see guys like you have picked up on, grown massive audiences in the wake of that. And I'm just very pleased that we live in a world where, there's an abundance of media resources, there's an abundance of social media stuff, people can interact properly. I'm a big advocate of free speech, written 2 books, done a lot of fun stuff, and I'm now kind of running more businesses behind the scenes, but I'm still doing a show 3 times a week, which is part of the fun. It's like the University of Gareth. I get to interview all kinds of people I find interesting, and the audience gets the bonus of enjoying that with me.
So, I got to ask you the fundamental question. Why are you still in South Africa? I mean, you're clearly a man of lots of talents. You're clearly a man with a lot of experience. I'm sure lots of people must say this to you all the time. I think you're Gauteng based, so obviously there's something in the water on your side of the world where, like, if you drink something from the tap, you wake up the next morning going, "We need to immigrate." So, why are you still in the country, if I may ask?
Sure, it's not as if it hasn't ever crossed my mind. I think we live in a world where certainly the open society wants us to think of borders as not being particularly important. It is even of countries as not being particularly important. But I'm of the soil. I have in our family graveyard. I have 5 generations of ancestors that are buried there before me. All
Mm.
direct people who, if they hadn't existed, I wouldn't exist. My family on both my father and mother's side have made enormous contributions to this country. My dad's one great grandfather was Charles Henry Somerset, Governor of the Cape. My mother's Afrikaans family, quite illustrious. There's Piet Retief in there. There's Andries Pretorius. There's my great grandfather Gustav Prello, who started the Afrikaanse Tweede Taalbeweging, along with Leipold and Marais and Langenhoven. And I feel like this is where I belong. I think this is also the place I can make the most of a difference. And I like South Africa. I don't see why, just because we're being run by a circus, that all of us have to immediately repair to somewhere else. Plus, frankly, where is better? I mean, the whole world is going through a bit of an identity crisis at the moment. Would you want to live in the Middle East? I'm fairly sure you wouldn't, even in places that are glittery and shiny like Dubai. There's no soul there. It's not a place of great history. That to me is an important part of why I'm here. Europe, while it's a place of great history, is now a place without any testosterone at all. So that's not something I'd be interested in rejoining over a gap of some 300 or 400 years since my ancestors decided to leave the place. And I don't know that anywhere except America is showing, and perhaps Argentina, are showing the sorts of shoots of what I might be interested in. But I don't believe that you need to be in a place to be able to reap the benefits of what's going on in those places now. There's such an abundance of knowledge and such a sharing of useful and salient information all over the place that where you end up being, it becomes a bit of a preoccupation with some people. I remember there was this mad thing among particularly white South Africans to get a passport for somewhere. This was like the last ditch effort. Should we be cornered in some part of the country? This is what we would do. I've never had those feelings of insecurity or inferiority, or that everything's going to fall apart and that I'm going to be the victim of circumstance. I think this is where I make the most important difference, most important contribution.
Yeah, and I can actually understand that myself. I mean, I've got the ability to live anywhere else in the world. I understand a lot of people don't have that, and so I'm rather privileged in that respect. And it's funny because I often tell people I choose to live in South Africa. I'm not living in South Africa because I'm forced to, and I appreciate. Some people feel that they are forced to live in South Africa because of circumstance. But I'm very much like you. So I've done background checks into my family,
Mhm.
and my family can trace its lineage to South Africa to 1750, and that's from both sides.
Yeah.
So for nearly just over 250 years, my ancestors have lived on this continent. And, it's not like each of them only lived 100 years. And it's like, you've got like three generations there. I mean, that's numerous generations. And it's actually very interesting to see how they've moved around over
Well,
time.
I mean, we live in a place where there's oral tradition, and we live in a place where
Mm,
there is a reverence for ancestors. But I'm absolutely gobsmacked on a daily basis by how many people pay absolutely no attention to who their ancestors were and don't even know their names, or where they were buried, or where they were born, or the faintest thing about them. I did go to an illustrious Xhosa wedding once, where the bridegroom, uh, a now somewhat less impressive person in his latter years, and with the sorts of things he's chosen to support. But he managed at that point to give an oral history of his family going back to the 1680s, which I thought was very impressive. And it was one of the things that I thought, here's someone who walks the talk when it comes to ancestors. But even that aside, and we can all lay claim to various things. You've got to be able to prove that you have the claim to those things. There are bridges that have been built by people that aren't that distantly related to me. There are buildings, there are institutions, there are languages, as I mentioned earlier. There are articles, there are pieces of valuable South African culture, artifacts, in fact, that I'm very pleased to be the heir to. And I think that all of
mm.
us in South Africa would be richer if we accepted the fact that we've got a tremendous amount of a valuable inheritance in this country, regardless of who initially created it, and that we'd stop squabbling like children over it. You see these families that when a rich grandfather dies, they start attacking each other and fighting over who's going to get the dining room table or whatever, instead of making more. They see it as the pie only being so big, and I have a suspicion that's where our conversation may go.
So actually, it's very interesting because I'm a massive fan of history. Um, so the swords behind me, for example, a lot of people asked in the comment section what the swords are from. But those swords are actually from 1907, the
Hmm.
British Army Police.
Okay.
Um, and they were actually the police that were sent around during the war to basically make people behave. Because obviously a lot of the men were away, and those were the rapiers and the sidearms, including the bayonet and all of the individuals' war memorials. I've also got a hand signed copy of the Bible by Jan Smuts,
Lovely.
which which is was quite I was quite lucky to get. I'll tell you the story then in a second. And I've got a British 303 rifle that was actually used 1942. So it's actually killed Nazis.
Sure.
Um, and a lot of these things I pick up usually on auction. I'm a huge big history buff on them, and it's very interesting to actually see the rationality of how they land up on auction. It's usually like there's a deceased to say somewhere, kids
Mm.
don't want anything to do with it, or the kids moved abroad and they're like, this stuff is worthless old junk in granny's house, and
Sell
they put it
it.
up for sale. You know, so you end up buying some of the stuff. That Jan Smith's Bible, for example, I picked up for like 500 rand.
Yeah.
It's like, who
I love
wouldn't buy that? I mean,
we'll,
it's
we'll probably end up bidding against each other at some auction at some point, because I love collecting things like this. I'm a compulsive collector.
mm,
So I find all these things that amuse me that are not particularly interesting to anyone else. Anyway, what do you want to know?
mm. So, I mean, very interesting. The topic are actually around immigration is obviously very important at the moment because obviously the Trumps had this whole inviting South Africans to go be refugees in America.
Yeah.
So, are you Are you thinking you might be a good refugee? You can go over there.
No, but I do think it's great that he's brought attention to a set of issues which South Africa has been grappling with for some time. And, it's been okay for people to beat up on farmers in particular, then obviously Afrikaans white South Africans, then white South Africans. We all know that despite all the howling from the mainstream media, there are absolutely race laws in this country. There are things that control the way that you do business. I believe our Minister of Finance, while we're recording this, is trying to, whether he will or not, trying to table yet more taxes. Um, we're being turned into a minority that is there to farm tax, and where we're treated with less and less seriousness and respect by our government. And I'm just delighted that the most important man in the world, in the most important country in the world, has us on his radar, because that doesn't just give me a feeling of international significance, which is important enough for people who've kind of just fallen off the radar. And I do mean South Africa in general. I don't mean white South Africans, but also because they are going to determine the course of international relations in the world, and a new, in inverted commas, world order in a non-sinister way, for at least the next 4 years, and possibly for the next 30 or 40 years. I heard a fascinating conversation just this morning about how this is the end of that post sort of war society, where everything has been about whatever we do, we must just make sure there are no more Hitlers, which is a laudable
Mm.
cause, but there hasn't been a higher ideal, and people are now over that. They're looking for some, particularly young people, are looking for something meaningful to stand for, and I mean, your pronouns and your mental health are just not a good enough higher ideal, I'm
Mm.
afraid.
Yeah, I think the Hitler scenario though is a difficult one, right? So everybody's like lofty idea is you shouldn't have a reproduction of Hitler, but then if you ask them what they mean by that, there's usually two things that come to mind. The first is obviously the Holocaust. The second is the war. But they forget that there were other things that Hitler stood for. That by throwing the baby out with the bathwater, you kind of lose everything. So there were things that Hitler was very good at in terms of getting his entire population back to working, to be highly nationalistic, to
Look,
to
um,
to
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I know where this conversation leads, and it doesn't lead anywhere particularly useful. Unfortunately, what's happened now, and maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't, but I get annoyed by revisionist history, and I get
Mm,
annoyed because people look at everybody in history. You said you're a fan of history, so
absolutely.
you're probably already warm to the idea that there is no such thing as a perfect historical figure. They're all full of
No.
flaws, and even the ones who are absolutely beyond redemption, like Hitler, for example, there were things that they contributed to the world and taught the world, which we would be poorer without. Rocket technology was a Nazi thing, the autobahn.
Mm,
There are lots of things that you could say. It certainly doesn't excuse the bad things about him, but I hate
100%.
that people are now going and nitpicking Winston Churchill, for example, and saying, "Oh, well, this guy wasn't perfect." Duh. But he certainly saved the free world from Nazism, along with, again, both of my grandfathers who put on uniform against their will, or whether they were feeling brave and wanted to do it. I don't know what their inner turmoil might have been, but they went and fought in Europe and North Africa and Italy for the cause of freeing the world and keeping the world safe from Nazism. Now, they only get a mention here because I happen to be their grandson and on this podcast, but God help us, we have to hear the stories of victims of every human tragedy, and there are lots, and all of them,
Mm.
again, are people who deserve to be heard. But we hear more from those people than we do about the people who rescued the people who've been in trouble all over the world.
Oh,
There are
absolutely.
South Africans right now fighting for God knows what cause in Central Africa, and the cause is unclear. They are not treated as war heroes. They're given the president couldn't even be bothered to pitch up at Waterkloof Air Force Base to see their remains brought home. But they're given this kind of a wink and a pass. There is no honor given to people who've already laid their lives down and sacrificed everything all over the world for the right causes. We now have to celebrate weakness and sad stories and people who go on television talk shows and tell us how hard they've had it. I'm just
Mm.
over it. And I won't have a conversation about what Hitler did well, because the list is a lot shorter than the list of terrible things he did. But I don't want to get into like
Absolutely.
revisionist history where we do a ledger and we try to find a couple of bad things about people who mostly were good, so we can balance it out and look like we're thoughtful and intellectual, or do the contrary with bad people and try to find a couple of good things. I just find it tiresome.
Yeah, I get that entirely, but obviously the point that I was trying to make is that if you consider it from that perspective, one of the things that Hitler was very good at was obviously the idea of the nation state. Now, the problem is that in the process of doing that in the 21st century, what we seem to now find is that nobody wants to actually have anything to do with forms of your nation state. The nation state means nothing. The nation state has now been devolved into just the global ideal.
Yeah.
But the global ideal still has to be paid for by someone. In this instance, obviously, been the United States for a while. They've
Mm-hmm.
been the one that's having to pay for this lofty ideal. And
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, what it's meant is that a lot of the internal political leaders in places such as South Africa actually quite often, very rarely, think about the national interest. There's always like some kind of other ideal. And you find this a lot, even in things like during COVID. You know, let's all shut down borders because we don't want all this stuff to go around. Or don't worry, we're all in it together. I'm not being funny, but I don't want to be in it together. It's a bit like saying
Well,
all
I
Jews
mean,
were in the gas chambers, so it's okay. Well, no, I'm
yeah,
sorry, I didn't want to be in the gas chamber.
there's an inherent hypocrisy in shutting down borders that you don't really believe in, right? As soon as you feel
Absolutely.
personally threatened. I mean, China, again, paradoxically, they seem to have a national plan, a national strategy, national ideals. Um, Whether or not those
Mm.
are good for China or humanity, people will discuss in far loftier places than you and I. But it seems that the Western world in particular has decided that those sorts of discussions are verboten because they might lead to another Hitler. That was my point about saying
Yeah.
bringing the open society into this. So I think that South Africa needs a purpose. I think we need, and we always complain about our leaders, and they are dreadful across the board. I don't think there's anyone who's impressing me at the moment. I held out a little bit of hope for Gayton. I still do. I think he's charismatic. He's got, he's got a following that seems to be growing. I like the fact that he got into his ministry and he started doing, not just saying, because there's so much announcement of this, announcement of that, and then nothing that happens afterwards. And the only actions that seem to be taken are the actions that are really bad for us.
Mm.
And then, Gayton comes along. It's kind of a fresh approach, but whether or not anybody has the balls to stick up to the ANC and actually stand for, you know, not raising taxes, the NHI being a disaster, the Bella Act being such a mess, expropriation without compensation, or nil compensation as they call it now. These things take courage, and I'm afraid that the amount of courage you can find in the GNU could put in a thimble, and there'd still be space enough for you and me.
Yeah, unfortunately, obviously the biggest problem that they've got in the GNU, as you're well aware of, is that they don't want to break the GNU, but in the process, they're compromising everything, every reason they had for getting in it in the first place.
Right. So what's the point of it then? So if it
Mm.
just becomes a rubber stamp for really cuck things, then why be in it? Because
Well,
you
absolutely.
see, this is also the reason you brought up COVID just now. This is the reason that so many people who I used to admire and trust and treat as friends, I can't talk to anymore because they were complicit in COVID. And
Mm.
I don't have a problem with them as people, but they can't talk about this stuff without losing their minds. They become
Mm.
like zombies. They start screaming and yelling and like getting in your face and like, you're an anti-vaxxer or whatever. And I go, I've never I've never ever said anything about vaccines, actually, publicly or
Mm.
not. I'm not a medical professional, but being a skeptic of anything doesn't mean you're a denier of that thing. And you're just trying to label me to get me out of the conversation. You're also the one getting emotional about this. And I,
Mm.
I can't sit at lunch with you if you were my friend and you behave like that, because it's an attention seeking thing, or it's because you're feeling guilty or whatever. But I don't need to be part of that. I'll just get out of there.
Yeah, but those ab hominem arguments now, obviously, they're all the rage. The simple thing is, if you push a policy that's nationalistic, you're going to get tarred as being Hitler. If you
Yeah, of
push
course.
if you push any form of narrative that now says, well, actually, I might not necessarily agree with the government on this because of this rational reason, they're going to go, that's because you're racist.
But do you care?
All arguments.
Do you care about being called things?
No, no, not anymore. In fact, I actually, I've made the allegation many, many times, or the claim many times, that I don't actually think racism means racism anymore. I
I,
think the words actually lost any form of meaning.
the sort of person, I think you're right. The sort of person who would level, and I've been called all of them, right? The
Mm,
misogynist, racist, sexist, Islamophobe, homophobe, transphobe, God knows what other words. My standard response to people I care about who would never say something like that to me, but if they would, is let's talk about it,
mm,
because you don't just throw slings and arrows at people, and those are pejoratives that you're calling me. So if it's someone I care about, and there's a very few people that I care about, if it's someone I do not know on social media, for example, the response, and you don't even need to say it sometimes, you just ignore it, right? Because what you think of me is none of my business. I don't care how you feel about me. That doesn't,
mm,
I don't know you. You don't have an impact on my life. You calling me that, you haven't won anything. That's
mm.
that's a very facile, very low resolution take on something that you've read about me, seen about me, heard from me, and tangentially in your child mind, you've come up with something to call me so you can put me in a box. I don't care about that. You can call me whatever you like.
Yeah, unfortunately, though, that's now, as much as I hate to say it, that's the norm, though, isn't it? I mean, that's one of the things that many of the people that do the type of things that we do, podcasts and so forth, have all been kind of caught on. Ramon is a good example.
Oh, they call
Where is
us.
Ramon?
Yeah, but you see, they're trying to. Where is he, man? I've been waiting on this call with you for like 15 minutes. Um, these guys use that tactic because they want to discredit you. It's like saying something misinformation or disinformation, so that they
Mm,
can just take it out of the argument. Because they know if they actually have to argue on the facts, or they have to bring up a decent, sensible, reasoned way to approach something, it's going to fall apart completely. And they're seeing that left, right, and center all over the world, but mostly left. And I'm not falling for any of this crap anymore. I haven't for the longest time. I've been scaling down my involvement in media for some time, and that's on purpose, because mostly I'm a little bit bored by having circular arguments. And I like doing my show because I can speak to people from all over the world about things that I haven't learned and haven't heard before, and hopefully that my audience can derive benefit from in the process. And I've had a very, very exciting and happy and tremendously interesting time doing the things that I'm doing. But I'm not doing it because I'm trying to stay relevant, or because I care about what people think, or I want to be popular. Those things left me more than 10 years ago. And I've been doing this stuff because if I don't genuinely enjoy it, I mean, I took time off over December. I didn't do that because I decided, we need to take a break, or the staff need a break, or I don't want to do this anymore. It's okay. I think let's just stop for 2 weeks. And everybody was there when we came back. That's how it goes. And
mm.
and I'm thrilled that I'm able to operate with this kind of independence. I'm uncancelable. That was by design. I had to have a number of big and sometimes consequential fights with people who had a lot more influence, money, power, and sometimes respect than I ever had. And I feel like my track record is good. I don't need to trumpet that either. It's just
Mm.
something that I'm now able to put into the file and say, this is my contribution on that front. I'm good. Whatever you guys are doing, good. There are new people that come along, take the place, start talking about new things, and I'm happy to kind of just recede ever so slightly every couple of months until eventually you don't know where I am or what I'm doing.
So I don't know if you've actually read it. There's a book called On Bullshit by Harry Frankfurt.
No.
So So it's a book written in 2005, but it's basically around a theory of online engagements. And what he basically says is that online engagements are very very different from what he calls traditional lies, because traditional lies are done with the intention of misrepresenting a fact. He says, but online bullshit, as he calls it, is actually done to cause a psychological effect, whereby they use what he calls dry humor in order to make deliberate false claims. But the false claims, there's no clear idea of whether they care if it's untrue. They just want to create an impression. And so it's the creation of the impression that matters more than the fact in itself. And unfortunately, that seems to be, and he says this is actually a phenomenon that's limited basically to the online revolution. And if you think about it, it's kind of true. Just check your
Oh,
engagements every day on Twitter.
yeah, and it shows you that that's not real life, which we've discussed, and I think
Mm-hmm.
I watch what you do, and I love the fact that we're now able to have meaningful conversation in this mud cesspool of just people throwing invective at each other. But I think it's provided a nice insight into humanity in general. Of course, there are loud places on the internet where you get a disproportionate response. I'm not pursuing the truth because I'm trying to go into battle with sword and shield for some cause. It's just an easier way to live. You don't have to remember two versions of everything. You don't have to remember every interaction and which one you told what. And it's just easier to just be honest. And for me, freedom is the highest goal of all. I prize freedom, and freedom. The definition of that means to be able to say what I think and do what I say. And that also is the same as my definition of integrity. So for me, freedom and integrity go together. I get to say what I think, do what I say. You'll never be in any doubt what I feel about something, because if you ask me, I will tell you. And I'm
Mm.
certainly not going to hold back if there's stuff that I think is nonsense.
Yeah. No, I say this actually because this rationality, this idea, this theory of impression is quite pertinent. A good example of it is look at the impression you would get by looking at Julius Malima's tweets, right? And anybody who tweets about Julius Malema, according to the impression of that, like that guy's freaking the next president of the republic. Next elections, he's the fourth largest political party with less votes than the local kind of church sale. But what can I say? That's the impression that people give, and I suppose that there's this article or this podcast that's now doing the rounds today around Noma. I don't know if you've seen it, where he basically gives the impression of this pseudo scientific intellectualism, where he talks about Neanderthals and white genealogy, and he basically says that whites are equivalent to dogs, and we can't deal with Ubuntu because it's like training a rabid dog to be a guard dog. And it's ironic because those very comments, the impression would be that those are kind of normal amongst the black majority, but they're not, are they?
Well, no, I mean, I don't think so. I think that is a stupid person's idea of baiting. Like,
Hmm.
this is what a very stupid person does, hoping to lure out the racism in others, right? The way that
Mm.
guy spoke, and I only know about the clip because you sent it to me. The way that guy spoke is the way that awful people throughout history have spoken about Jews, about blacks, about Indians, about people in the Caribbean, people all over the place, others, right? So this is an in-group looking out with fear and or hatred towards another group. It's just awful. But I also don't think that we should be banning it. I don't think we should react hysterically to it. I think this is the kind of thing that the world needs to see, and this is the kind of thing that does not help mainstream media in South Africa who say Trump should stay out of our business. The ANC who say Trump's. The more people in America see that, the more they're going to go, "Oh my God, these white guys in South Africa really are dealing with some very low IQ people." And the fact is,
Hmm.
all of South Africa is dealing with low IQ people because some of them are in government. These are not people you would trust to sit the right way around on a lavatory, and yet they are making important policy decisions and pronouncements about what the future of this country might look like. Of course, very little of it comes to fruition because they are just so incompetent. that we can ignore them most of the time. And that's also part of the saving grace of living here. But I don't worry about, like, I don't know who this guy is who said those things. I don't know. I don't think I'll ever have any dealings. I'm not going to invite him onto my show. He's not the kind of guy I want to sit and discuss anything with. He's just a straight up racist. If he was saying those things about black people and he were white, it would be at the Human Rights Commission. It would be on TV news tonight. It would be, because finding white racism is actually a really, really hard business these days. They have to get into your thoughts and try and police those to try and find signals that people like you or me, deep down inside, we're not actually saying what we think. We actually hate black people, and we're just hiding it really well. And they'll discover it if they can just get into our tweets and do some kind of meta analysis. Meanwhile, there's a guy like this being blatantly racist, and people are like, "Oh well." Mostly because it's also okay to beat up on white people, right? It's the only prejudice you're allowed to still have, particularly straight white males. You're totally allowed to be as rude or as vulgar or as demeaning and demoralizing as those guys are, because they'll just take it. They just have to take it. And I
Well,
think
they
we
have to take it. Legally, they have to take it. Legally, the law almost dictates that, as you know from the Human Rights Commission with Julius Malema, there's supposedly, when racial claims are made, there has to be given context to the people who are doing it because of their historical past.
this is
Apparently,
this is pure leftism at work, and unfortunately, we live in a country where that kind of nonsense, though it's been funded by USAID and other international organizations, Soros's, you know, societies and so on, but that doesn't mean it's right, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't say that this guy, he's just an appalling human being to say these things, but I don't need to let it upset me.
mm.
Instead, I think we should allow these people to out themselves, because a guy like that is going to also complain about racism, right?
Mhm.
Unironically, like if you sit in a room with him, he'll tell you how put upon his ancestors and he in particular have been, and how they suffer today from something that happened last 30 years ago. And there are all kinds of indirect racism happening, and it's the greatest crime against humanity. That guy will complain about that, and then before even finishing that sentence or taking a breath, he'll climb into like white men and say how, we're basically dogs and rabble and made of Neanderthal blood. And by the way, Neanderthal blood's not so bad.
Well, the biggest
But,
difficulty I think a lot of people.
sorry, I won't be baited into that, because I'm not as stupid as the trap he's laying. A lot of people would go, "Oh no, but now we have to say why that's not true." But you don't have to fight stupidity with reason. People who have reason going on in their universe will respond to reason, but people who don't have reason going on in the universe, you can. That's like trying to argue with a sparrow. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, but the biggest reason is that what it does is it creates this narrative, this impression that obviously South Africa is deeply hostile to white people, and in some respects, it may be, but only from an impressionable point of view, right? And that has meant that, and I personally woke up with a lot of comments with people coming to me basically saying, well, you need to immigrate, you need to get out, and the country's all going to the dogs. And there's some truth in some of it. But the reality is that what a lot of these individuals are failing to understand is that, yes, this individual has said stuff like this. Yes, it might not necessarily be true. Yes, it might be hurtful. I've frequently heard recently Elon Musk's father say some pretty horrendous things too. And you can't basically excuse one and not the other, right? You kind of have to
Well,
be, you have to take both of them. I mean, that's the nature of equality of the whole thing. But the point I was going to make is the responses to articles like this, for me, actually goes back to the very first question I asked you, which is everybody's like, okay, you got to leave. And I find this odd because when they have problems, and I say this on my show a lot, when they have problems in the US, the first response to most individuals isn't, I'm going to immigrate. Immigrate to where? Canada?
well, funnily enough, I mean, it is among people like, Barbara Streisand and celebrities on the West Coast who, oh, if Trump wins, I'm going to emigrate. They always say these things because it's kind of
Then
a
they never do.
it's a last ditch thing. It's almost like
Hmm.
a, I'm not feeling loved and appreciated thing.
Hmm.
I think you must do whatever you want to do. If you're a parent of particularly young kids and you feel like, because they're white, they're not going to get jobs here, or they're not going to necessarily be able to perform at the level that they might in any other economy, as clearly, Elon's mother thought when they emigrated. They might go on to be the world's richest man in some other place and not make a contribution here, and that would be our loss. I feel like for many people, the reason to go somewhere as opposed to stay here needs to be a positive one. You must go somewhere else because there's some opportunity there that you're really interested in pursuing. There's something that you're excited about. There's something that you want to take advantage of. There are infrastructures in terms of support systems, family, friends, a job, whatever it might be, that will put you in the pound seats to make your life the best possible life. Then I back you 100%, and I would be your biggest supporter. And I don't have any issues about patriotism or nationalism or any of that stuff. If, however, you do decide to stay in South Africa, I think it is your duty to say what you really think. We've got this huge problem in this country where people are polite when they're face to face with each other. But then there's this seething resentment that happens behind the scenes. And it's very easy to criticize people like you and I who are doing thousands of hours of content in a year and say, well, those guys, I don't like this thing they said or that thing they said or this thing they did. But I never tell anybody how I really feel because all of my opinions would be socially unacceptable. Do you know what I mean? It feels like you're kind of you're trying to impose yourself on a fight that you aren't actually. You're not on the battlefield. You're there after the battle, picking jewelry off the corpses and complaining about the way the battle was fought. Well, where were you when the battle was going on? And by this, I'm speaking figuratively, of course, because people,
Hmm.
when they hear terms like battle, they immediately think, oh, well, this means that Gareth is some kind of bloodthirsty guy who believes there's going to be a an actual like race war or something. That I really think that most people in this country get along just fine. I have never had anyone call me a racist to my face. And I'm a fairly well-known person who said a lot of stuff. I've never
Hmm.
had anyone I've never had anyone come up to me and go, "I will not be in a room with you because I think you're a deplorable human being." Quite to the contrary, I find that the people I've met on a day-to-day basis, because they recognize me more often than I them, we have very interesting interactions. They're friendly, they're kind, they're generous. This is a country I love living in. If we had a better government, and by that I don't even care about, how efficient they are, although that would be nice. I had no power last night. Um, I'd also just like them to just be morally upstanding people, like, not steal. I'd like to be able to trust them with a few things. And I don't mean that I want to hand over all responsibility to the state either. I'm not an infant. I would prefer the state to have as small an influence on my life as possible. But where they should be important is in the things that they collectively need to look after for us: roads, electricity, water, the border, policing, the courts, and all of those things they're just shit at. So if they could make an effort in that direction and just be a little more morally upstanding and less reptilian and reprehensible, I'd be thrilled. We'd be 90% of the way there. And I do think that everyone in this country would support that and be thrilled to see just the slightest improvement. And it wouldn't be hard for them to do. It really wouldn't be hard. They could just promise a little bit and deliver an even smaller bit of that, and we would go, well done, because our expectations are so low.
Yeah. But there's a point you made there that I would actually 100% agree on. That is, if many individuals wanted to leave to pursue an opportunity, no one's going to sit back and say, well, that was dumb. Like, yeah,
No,
okay, if
no.
there's an opportunity, like, you should pursue it. But if your response is to leave because of, a fear, a false expectation appearing to be real to you, in other words, this is something that might happen and I'm scared of this, and, this could be this, and it's like, oh, they don't have crime abroad, then that's not really a good reason to go. Because if you look at
No,
many other countries' crime statistics, sometimes they're just as bad as ours. Just they are different.
I don't know if you agree with this, but the default setting for humans is not peace and prosperity. That
Hmm.
that is very much an effect of our generation,
21st century.
the one
Mm.
before, and maybe a little bit of the one that just came through the war. The latter part of their lives was spent in
Hmm.
some peace, some sense of global peace. Of course, there have been horrible things like Rwanda and the Balkans and Iraq 1, Iraq 2, and the whole Middle East in Israel Palestine terms. Now we've got Russia, Ukraine. So obviously there are things going on. I'm not oblivious to those. But this is an exception, not a rule. By and large, humans are in perpetual insecurity. They are always fighting for their family, their lives, their property, their position in society. It's a constant battle. We're actually engaged in that sort of almost Darwinian, but certainly survivalist stuff throughout our history. And then suddenly there comes this golden age where we're complaining about how people talk about us online, and we think we've got difficulty. We think, oh, our lives are so hard. You've got those swords up behind you. There are so many stories from history of people who've had to, because someone had a tall hat in Rome, or because they wore a crown, or because they were fighting with their cousin, they had to just put on armor or a uniform and go and fight for something they weren't even sure what they were fighting for half the time. The
Mm.
Pope has had a disagreement with some priest in northern Germany, and suddenly you find your whole village is drafted, and the women and children are wailing at the gates of the village, and you're off to fight some horrific war. That is the natural condition of humanity here in sub-Saharan Africa. For all of the history of this time, there was no like peaceful, utopian, idyllic period where everybody just got along, and it was this idea of the noble savage that was so popular in the 1800s, that people were just all happy and happy. Shaka was a violent, aggressive empire builder, a colonialist of this part of the world for the longest time. And after him, Dingaan was, perhaps in some ways better, in some ways worse. After him, Mpande, and that's just the history of the Zulu. If we look at so many other parts of South African history, all of which are fascinating, we will find stories of people who are really having a hard time. And then we sit around now in 2025 and we're like, oh, you know, it's tough here. I think I'm going to go to New Zealand, only to find in New Zealand that the Maoris are granted more rights than the New Zealand white population. If you're going to see yourself as a victim, though, I'd rather you weren't here. I mean, I don't have
Mm.
a lot of time for that. Whether you're black, whether you're white, old, young, rich, poor. If you feel like a victim in your soul, I really don't have any space for you in mine. Then you
Mm.
must just get out of my way, because to have you whine and complain and bitch and moan and nag and tell me how sorry for yourself you're feeling is, oh, it's destructive. It's depressing. It's miserable.
Mm. I think a lot of people actually very conveniently forget how the world actually got into World War One and to a degree World War Two. They tend to forget that it came straight off the Napoleon Wars. We had the wars here, the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa. We went almost straight from there into World War One, straight from World War One into the Prussian Wars, and then straight from there into World War Two. Like the world is constantly been in war, but after World War Two, the wars of the world have slowed down because of one fundamental thing: nuclear bombs. Everybody understands that obviously to engage in the traditional warfare that we went into for the longest time has dramatic impacts on every society. You just bomb the crap out of them into the Stone Age, and that's pretty much the end of that. So the reality is that because of that, countries have had a concerted effort to be a little bit more polite with each other, and that's given this artificial idea that, as you rightly say, the default setting for everybody is just to get along, but it's not
Yeah.
the default
Well,
setting at
yeah,
all.
I think it's this is what happens in particularly spoilt Western countries, which again brings us to the decline of Western civilization. It may yet be rescued, but I'm I'm an optimist on most things, as I'm not. Um, there's this weakness of spirit. There's this inability to
Mm.
stand up for yourself and what's good. And also, to be frank, like a lot of our conversations so far, and I hope we aren't going too long about this or boring anybody, but clearly, when you're a fan of history, it strikes you that other people are not, and you are very often disappointed by the fact that most people in the world, not just here in South Africa, don't read or learn anything about history. So they have this
Mm.
very, very simplistic, childlike idea of good guys and bad guys. And because it's taught with such laissez faire, almost carelessness at high schools, most history teachers are like, oh, I've got to teach this stuff. There are a few, and I had one or two of them, and I thank them every day for the fact that they imbued in me a sense of like the past is important because it's about people, teaches you about human nature. It's the only subject you do at school that's about humans. And you learn a lot about what could happen in the future by studying the past. There's nothing new under the sun. And
Absolutely.
learning about I had a conversation with a friend of mine the other day about Sulla, right? The Roman dictator who preceded Caesar. And the fact that we were both talking about this to us wasn't weird until someone else said, "What the hell are you guys talking about? Are you talking about Star Wars or something?" And I suddenly realized, like, and this person wasn't stupid. They just don't know a damn thing about history, and they're poorer for it. And South Africans
Mm.
don't know a damn thing about their history. They don't know about their own personal history or the history of the country. They just know, okay, 94, Mandela, apartheid bad, post apartheid good, and I'm afraid this is how the ANC have been treated in the international arena. And that's what's so funny about watching this Trump thing unfold is that you've got people who've been treated like and patronized like children by the international diplomatic community, where literally South Africa walks into the room and gets patted on the head. Oh, you're so clever for 94, even 30 years later, and then ignored, like treated with disdain because frankly, we don't bring anything to the table anymore. We're no longer a place of political capital. So when someone actually has the temerity to criticize the ANC for their international relations with Iran, for their treatment of farmers in South Africa, or their race laws on our books here in South Africa, or many of the other things that it's worth criticizing this government about, corruption, their every single thing they've backed for the last 15 years that has been a disaster, that has resulted in nothing but increased poverty and a decrease in overall well-being for everybody in this country. It's got worse. And they are not used to being told that by anybody but a small group of people in South Africa brave enough to say it. And they got to get used to this because if you want to be treated like an adult, then you're going to be criticized sometimes and not just complimented. But they have no immune system for this at all. It's great to watch.
I think it's very interesting the comments you said actually about your personal history. So actually, my personal history actually when I found out about it or when I did some research, and it's actually kind of fascinating. It's fascinating in comparison to the national dialogue going on right now. So if I look at both sides of my family, right? So actually, the first side of my family is from Scotland, and it's very
Don't worry,
interesting to understand what.
nobody's perfect.
But it's very interesting to understand why they left Scotland. And that was actually because at the time there was a failed attempt by a Scottish leader to take the throne of England. And as a result, many of the Scots were chased off their lands and sent off their lands in
That would have
retaliation.
been that would have been in the 1700s. Bonnie Prince Charlie, right?
100%. Well done. Great. You're straight smack bang on the money there. So many of them got chased off their lands from the Highlands when their lands were expropriated without compensation, and they were told to get off there in retaliation for trying to overthrow the king. Now you see the second side of my family is actually from Prussia, which no longer exists. It's now a little bit of mix between northern Poland and a bit of Germany. But in that territory, I come from an Ashkenaz background. They were all chased off their land because of anti-Semitism, and
Yep.
guess what? Many of their properties were expropriated without compensation. And
And
so
by the way,
obviously they saw.
when we're talking about Ashkenazi Jews in what was then Prussia and
Mhm.
and parts of northern Poland, we're not talking about like saying people saying nasty things. We're talking about like Hamas levels of genocidal violence, right? The
Hmm.
pogroms are not a pogrom is not a word, a euphemism to to cover over some gentle activity which might not have been so nice to the Jews. Literal violent usurpation of all rights, physical aggression, murder on a large scale. These are things that humans should be very embarrassed about. And many of our South African Jewish population, our Jews here in this country, come from an Ashkenazi background. In fact, I'd say the
Hmm.
vast majority. And many of them either got out just before or just after the real shit hit the fan. So these people
Hmm.
are wily and tough. And the ones who are still here in South Africa and are still fighting the good fight and making a contribution ought to be treated with a little bit more respect by our government when they seem to be cozying up to Iran just because Iran's giving them money. I think it's disgusting. So it's interesting that that's where you come from too. So is that your mom or your dad's side?
Mother. So you
Okay.
see why that all becomes very interesting for me is that I've got two lines of family that both fled their lands because of expropriation without compensation. And what's the number one topic trying to drive whites out of the country at the moment? Expropriation without compensation. Two freaking 150 years later, still the same bullshit, man. Like,
Someone,
us.
some people would say that you haven't learnt your genetic lessons yet. But, but
Some.
as Charlton Heston said at that one Republican conference, or was an NRA conference or something, but I repeat myself. He said, "You want to take my gun?" He was already old. Do you remember? He said, "I'll take it out of my cold, dead
Dead
hands."
hands. Yeah.
And I thought, okay, I mean, if it does come down to it, would I rather be one of those people who says, "You could take my stuff, but you could take it out of my cold, dead hands"?
Mm.
Or would I want to be one of those people who goes, "I've had enough. I just
I'm going
can't
to
anymore.
Australia.
I'm gonna go and live a lower middle class existence with a shitty little house in some horrible suburban part of a country that no one cares about, and try to live an approximation of what we do in this country by having a braai every 8 weeks instead of every week. No, I'm here and I'm living happily. Thank you. I've got family here. I've got friends here. I've got a country I care about. There is so much to keep me going, so much to keep me positive that I'm not going to let the news get me down. Try again, News 24. It's not going to happen.
I really like your outlook on that. Actually, been here nearly an hour, and I won't keep you for more than an hour, as we discussed. But actually, I got to ask you a couple of things actually on your background. So clearly, make four observations on the back. So clearly, you're a fan of Stoicism because I can see on the back there. I'm curious about your two Orthodox photos on the back there. So you
Oh,
obviously
yeah,
got
it's an
Jesus and
icon.
Mary there.
So this I bought
Mm,
this. I bought this in Bulgaria last year. I'm not I'm not even a Christian. This is just a cool. I thought it was a very beautiful icon. They make these, and it's
mm.
Christos Pantokrator, which is it's a representation of Jesus. It's quite well known in Eastern Orthodox Christianity.
Very much so.
I bought it because I just love. First of all, it's an original artwork, right? It's painted by hand. It's
Mm,
magnificently made, and it's a memento of my trip there. I collect
speaks to
loads
me.
of stupid stuff, dude, and great stuff. Obviously, I've got a house just overflowing with this stuff, and it makes me happy to see them. The things reminds me of the trips, reminds me of the people, and it generates a very real reminder of my interest in humans and in civilization and in stories from history. I love it.
So obviously, my second and my third and fourth observations, obviously Hitch 22 and what looks to be the Richard Dawkins book next to it on
Yeah,
evolutionary biology.
yeah, we've got
I think it's the greatest show. I think it's called.
Greatest Show on Earth and Hitch
Yeah.
22. Obviously, both of those guys were they were influences, particularly in my 20s. These were the intellectual giants of that decade. I still believe Christopher Hitchens was the greatest living public intellectual of my time on earth. He was indefatigable in debate. He was he had such a verbal intelligence that it begged belief. It seemed almost unfair that one man should be so blessed in that department. Um, I am a big fan of so much of what Dawkins did, but I feel like he's fallen off the wagon and become like so many people. Sam Harris too, like just Trump deranged, right? Um, I am by no means a cheerleader for any politician, but I think that Donald Trump must be judged as a man at a turning point in history, at the end of a long 20th century and the beginning of a nascent 21st century, a different way for the world to be. He's not the cause of it. He is able to read better than almost anybody. The guy has almost preternatural abilities to feel the vibe, the zeitgeist, right, as the Germans say, and to be able
Mm.
to make something of it. That's why he did so well in business. That's why he knew which buildings to buy in New York. It's why he knew to open casinos. And wherever he's failed, by the way, he's made that money back. You can criticize the guy for any number of things, but Donald Trump has a feeling. And remember, when he talks to audiences, he's very seldom going off a teleprompter. He's just going. And sometimes it's long and drawn out and boring, but people are captivated because they feel he's talking directly to them. And
Mm.
I'm so happy and I feel privileged to live in a time where I got to see people like Dawkins and Hitchens doing their thing, where I got to see the advent of the Obama era, because I think that was a very special and interesting time. I loved the 90s. I thought the 90s were a high point in social relations between people all over the world. And I'm so glad that I was a kid during that time, because I just loved everybody. I felt like we could conquer the world. I felt like optimism was raining down. I still have that feeling everywhere. And now I'm happy to be around to witness this next change. And it is, be under no illusion, this is a monumental seismic change in the direction that politics, society, and philosophy are going to take. And how lucky are we to be here to see it?
I absolutely agree. And I must say, very rare for me to obviously have a conversation with an individual and to listen to the individual more than obviously engage myself. So, that in itself actually should show everybody, you know,
I hope
interesting to.
I hope I haven't monopolized the conversation or bored
Not
anyone.
at all, but I think you have some interesting points, and it's nice to hear these points coming out of somebody else's mouth for a change. It's nice to see from my perspective that other people think and feel like I do, and I hope, dear viewer, that you feel the same. Like you're not alone in many of your thoughts and feelings, and it's actually there's a lot more of us that think like you than you would think. But anyway, where can everybody find you? Just to plug your own channels.
Oh, come on! If you haven't found me by now, I don't know if I want you to. Um, we're on a platform I've created with my business partner called The Real Network. There's a live show for 2 hours a day, 3 days a week. We do all kinds of things, from the sublime to the ridiculous. We'll talk about important and consequential stuff one day. The next day, we'll be laughing at memes. And I think that's how people are, and I love it. It doesn't feel like it's heavy lifting. The audience are keyed in on everything, and we're having a lot of fun. I think it's a conversation that many people feel that they're a part of, going into work in the morning, starting their day. And that was always an important thing for me to do when I was on radio and on television. It continues to be today. So go and check us out there. That's probably the best place to find me.
So I'm actually going to link it in the description box below.
Cool.
So obviously, everybody else, thanks for joining, and Gareth, thanks so much for taking the time to spend an hour with me.
Pleasure.
Hopefully, you can join me again.
Good stuff. Thanks, man.